I've seen way too many people grab a cheap, off-the-shelf UPS just because the price tag looks friendly, only to end up scrambling when the power flickers and their gear shuts down. The regret that follows is real. You're left with a box that either can't hold the load you need or cuts out the moment the grid wavers, and that can cost you downtime, lost work, or even hardware damage. So the question is whether stepping up to a higher-end unit actually feels like a smarter buy, or if you're just paying for a bigger name tag. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Eaton 9SX 3000VA 2700W is marketed as an online, double conversion UPS, which means it doesn't just sit in standby waiting for a blackout, it actually runs the load through its inverter all the time. That design choice eliminates the transfer delay that you get with Uninterrupted models, and for anyone whose equipment can't tolerate even a millisecond glitch, think servers, network switches, or a high-end video editing rig, that 0-second switchover is the core reason to look past the cheap alternatives. But it also means you're paying for a more complex internal architecture, and that complexity translates into a higher price and a little more setup work. Let's walk through a typical office or home studio scenario. Imagine you have a small rack that houses a couple of mini PCs, a NAS for backups, and a 24-port managed switch. You'd plug the NAS and the PCs into the L620R outlets, and the switch into one of the 620R receptacles. The 9SX's front panel LCD gives you a quick glance at input voltage, load percentage, and battery health, which is handy if you're the only IT person on call. Because it's an online unit, the output voltage stays within tight tolerances, so you won't see the occasional voltage sag that can cause a hard drive to spin down or a network card to reset. One of the practical strengths that shows up in real use is the mix of outlet types. The NEMA L620p input means you can feed the UPS from a dedicated 208V circuit, which you often find in commercial spaces, while the L630R and L620R outlets on the back let you run equipment that needs a 3-phase plug or a heavy-duty 20-amp connection. That flexibility saves you from having to buy separate power strips or adapters, and it keeps the power path clean, fewer connectors, fewer failure points. If you add the optional Network M2 card, you can monitor battery status, run self-tests, and even schedule graceful shutdowns from a remote console. For a small IT team, that remote visibility can be the difference between a controlled outage and a frantic scramble. The downsides are more about the hidden trade-offs than any glaring flaw. First, the unit is a tower that weighs close to 80 pounds, so you need a sturdy floor or a rack that can accommodate its footprint. It's not a plug-and-play appliance you can toss on a desk and forget about. Installation usually involves mounting a dedicated 208V circuit, which may require an electrician if you don't already have one in place. Second, the base runtime on the internal batteries is modest enough for a few minutes of backup, which is sufficient to keep a server online long enough for an automatic shutdown, but not for prolonged outages unless you add the external battery modules. Those modules are sold separately, so the advertised extended run is more of a future upgrade than something you get out of the box. Who should consider this UPS? If you run a small server room, a network closet, or a professional audio-video workstation where a sudden power loss could corrupt projects or bring a live stream to a halt, the Eaton 9SX gives you the confidence that the power stays clean and uninterrupted. It also appeals to businesses that need to meet compliance standards for uptime. The zero transfer time and remote monitoring are features that auditors often look for. On the other hand, if you're a solo freelancer who just needs a backup for a laptop and a monitor, a smaller line interactive UPS or even a UPS with a cheaper sine wave output will do the job for a fraction of the cost. Another practical point is the learning curve. The LCD menu isn't a touchscreen, and navigating through the settings, especially if you enable the network card, takes a few minutes of reading the manual. Once you have the basic parameters set, input voltage range, load capacity, alarm thresholds, you'll hardly need to touch it again, but that initial configuration can feel like a hurdle for someone who just wants to plug in a device and be done. Also, because it's a true online UPS, it draws a small amount of power continuously to run the inverter, so you'll see a slightly higher energy draw compared to a standby model. For most users the increase is negligible, but in a tight energy budget it's something to be aware of. From a value standpoint, the headline specs, 3000VA, 2700W, and double conversion are impressive, But the real money saver is the protection it offers. A single power interruption that takes